The late dry season of 1895 had turned the Arizona desert into a furnace of rust-red earth. Sand-laden winds whipped across the landscape, stinging the faces of travelers brave enough to venture through this unforgiving terrain. At the makeshift ferry crossing over a muddy tributary of the Gila River, wagons lined up like patient cattle, waiting their turn to reach the northern bank. Florence Edison clutched her modest traveling bag, the weight of a rejection letter from Boston heavy in her pocket. A widow at 23. She had sold everything from her late husband's tools to her grandmother's silver watch, hoping to return east. But that door had closed, leaving her stranded between worlds. The borrowed mule she'd hired suddenly bucked, spraying thick mud across her travel-worn dress. Before she could steady herself, a tall figure moved with surprising grace to catch her elbow. "Steady there, ma'am." The voice was deep, gentle as desert rain. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, though he bore no relation to the future president, the name suited his sturdy frame, stood before her. Trail dust coated his broad shoulders, and his gray eyes held the soft quality of dawn clouds. He was tall, weathered by sun and wind, with hands that spoke of honest work. "I've never touched a lady before," he stammered, face flushing crimson as he realized his hand still rested on her arm. He jerked back as if burned, nearly losing his own balance in the process. The absurdity of the moment, two adults teetering on a muddy riverbank like newborn colts, broke through Florence's carefully maintained composure. She laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its genuine warmth. "Well, Mr. Roosevelt, ma'am, Teddy Roosevelt, and I apologize for my—" He gestured helplessly at his offending hand, which only made Florence laugh harder. The ferry worker's good-natured ribbing drifted across the water. "Better hold tight to that one. Teddy looks like she's got more spirit than your horses." Teddy's flush deepened, but he managed a crooked smile. Fishing out his bandana miraculously clean despite the journey, he offered it to Florence. "For the mud, ma'am. This river's got a temper worse than a rattlesnake in August." She accepted the cloth with a nod of thanks, noting how he kept a respectful distance now, as if she might bolt like a spooked mare. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant rain and old gunpowder reminders that this land held both promise and peril. Teddy's eyes swept the black rock formations rising from the desert floor, a habitual scan of someone who'd learned to read danger in the landscape. Then, with the careful courtesy of a man unused to social graces, he gestured to his freight wagon. "If you'd care to sit up on the supply boxes, ma'am, it'd be easier than standing. The crossing can be rough when the current's running high." Florence hesitated, then accepted. As she settled onto a crate marked mining tools, fragile, she noticed how Teddy moved efficient, alert, but with an underlying nervousness whenever he glanced her way. The ferry ride proved more adventure than either expected. The ferryman, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Morse, who claimed distant kinship to the telegraph inventor, cursed creatively at the stubborn mule while fighting the current. A gust of wind caught Teddy's wide-brimmed hat, sending it spinning toward the murky water. Without thinking, Florence lunged forward, snagging the hat just before it touched the surface. Their eyes met as she handed it back, and Teddy's mumbled thanks came out so jumbled that Samuel Morse snorted with amusement. 30 years I've been running this ferry, and I never seen a man turn that particular shade of red. You feeling poorly?" Roosevelt. "No, sir, just the heat." Florence bit back a smile. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since noon. As they neared the opposite bank, the sky suddenly opened. Desert rain fell in sheets, brief but intense, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and sage. The shower passed as quickly as it came, leaving a faint rainbow arcing across the sky. "That's something," Teddy said quietly, his voice losing its nervous edge. "They say rain on a journey's first day brings good fortune." "Do they?" Florence kept her tone neutral, though her heart lifted slightly at the thought. She needed whatever fortune the desert might spare. My mother used to say so. He paused, seeming to realize he'd shared something personal. That is, back in Kansas, before. The sentence hung unfinished. Another story swallowed by the vast spaces of the West. Florence understood. Everyone here carried unfinished sentences, lives interrupted by death or circumstance or simple bad luck. As the ferry touched the northern bank, Teddy was already moving, securing ropes with practiced efficiency. He helped other passengers with their belongings, careful to maintain proper distance from the women, before returning to his wagon. Florence stood, unsure of her next move. The road stretched toward Gila Crossing, a collection of buildings that hardly deserved the name town. Beyond that lay what? She had no plan, no destination, only the knowledge that Boston had closed its doors and the West had taken everything else. "Ma'am?" Teddy stood beside his wagon, holding the reins of his team. "If you're heading to Gila Crossing, you're welcome to ride along. That is, if you don't mind freight wagons and rough roads." She studied him, this careful man who apologized for saving her from a fall, who blushed like a schoolboy, but moved with the competence of someone who'd survived in hard country. "I don't mind, Mr. Roosevelt, and thank you." He helped her onto the wagon seat with exaggerated care, as if she were made of spun glass. As they pulled away from the ferry, Florence noticed how he handled the horses firm but gentle, speaking to them in a low voice that carried surprising tenderness. "You know horses," she observed. "Easier than people," he admitted, then looked stricken. "That is, I didn't mean. What I meant was—" "I understand." And she did. Horses were honest in their needs and affections. People were altogether more complicated. The road to Gila Crossing wound through stands of mesquite and palo verde, past towering saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels. Teddy pointed out landmarks Weaver's Needle, where a prospector had died chasing gold that didn't exist. Skull Valley, named for reasons he didn't elaborate on. The place where the old Butterfield stage used to stop before the Apache Wars. Florence found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the wagon, the steady clop of hooves, the creak of leather and wood. When they passed a destroyed homestead, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth, she forced herself to look away. "Were you traveling alone, ma'am?" Teddy asked, then immediately added, "Not meaning to pry, just concerned for your safety." "Yes." The word came out harder than intended. "My husband passed 4 months ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." The response was automatic, what everyone said. But something in Teddy's voice, a weight that suggested personal understanding, made it feel less hollow. They rode in comfortable silence until the first buildings of Gila Crossing appeared through the heat shimmer. The town looked exactly as Florence had imagined, rough lumber and adobe thrown together by necessity rather than design. A small church steeple provided the only gesture toward permanence. "Not much to look at," Teddy said, almost apologetically. "But good people. Mostly. Sarah Turner at the boarding house serves the best cornbread this side of the Mississippi, and there's honest work for those who seek it. And dishonest work for those who seek that." He gave her a sharp look, then a small smile. "That too, ma'am, same as anywhere." As they entered the town proper, Florence felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. A young widow traveling alone attracted attention, rarely the good kind. She straightened her spine, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by her companion. "If anyone gives you trouble," Teddy said quietly, "you mention you're under my protection. Not that I'm anybody special, but I haul freight for most folks here. They know I deal square. And do I need protection, Mr. Roosevelt?" He considered the question seriously. "Everything needs protection out here. Ma'am, the sun, the drought, the storms, they don't choose favorites. But people—" He glanced toward the saloon, where piano music spilled into the street. "People you can usually reason with, one way or another." They pulled up outside a 2-story building that had seen better days. A painted sign read, "Turner's Boarding House, clean beds, hot meals." A woman emerged dark-skinned, wearing a flour-dusted apron, with eyes that missed nothing. "Theodore Roosevelt, what trouble have you brought to my doorstep now?" "No trouble, Mrs. Turner. This is Mrs." He looked at Florence, suddenly realizing they'd never properly introduced themselves. "Edison," Florence supplied. "Florence Edison." Mrs. Edison needs a room for the night," Teddy continued. "Maybe longer, if she decides to stay." Sarah Turner's assessment was quick but not unkind. "Room and board's $2 a week, paid in advance. No men above the first floor, no liquor in the rooms, no loud disturbances after 9 o'clock, breakfast at 6, dinner at 5. You miss it. You go hungry." "That sounds perfect," Florence said, meaning it. Structure, rules, boundaries after months of chaos. They felt like luxury. As Teddy unloaded her traveling bag, Florence noticed how the townspeople greeted him. Respectful nods from the men, careful smiles from the women. He responded to each with the same reserved courtesy, never quite meeting anyone's eyes for long. "Thank you," she said when he set her bag on the boarding house porch. "For the ride and the kindness." He touched his hat brim, that flush creeping back into his cheeks. "My pleasure, ma'am. I mean, not pleasure exactly, but that is, I understand. Mr. Roosevelt." She offered her hand to shake, a gesture that clearly startled him. After a moment, he took it carefully, as if it might break. "I haul freight regular between here and Prescott," he said. "If you need anything sent for, or, well, anything." Then he was climbing back onto his wagon, clicking to the horses, disappearing down the street toward the freight office. Florence watched him go, this careful man who handled her like spun glass and spoke to horses with gentleness. Sarah Turner chuckled beside her. "That one's been here 3 years, and I don't think he's spoken more than a dozen words to any woman in town. You must have made quite an impression." "He said he'd never touched a lady before." "Sounds like Teddy." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Good man, though. Dependable. Carries his past heavy. But don't we all?" Florence picked up her bag, feeling the weight of her own past in more than just the rejection letter in her pocket. As she followed Sarah Turner into the boarding house, she heard the distant rumble of thunder. The rainbow had faded, but the air still smelled of rain and possibility. Perhaps the desert hadn't taken everything after all. Perhaps, in this rough town where a careful man apologized for kindness and freight wagons passed for carriages, she might find whatever came after ending. The first steps were always the hardest, but she'd taken them now, muddy dress and all, into a story she couldn't yet name. Florence Edison had been the daughter of a blacksmith in Ohio, raised amid the ring of hammer on anvil and the acrid smell of hot metal. She'd learned early that life required both strength and flexibility. Iron could be shaped, but only with the right combination of heat and pressure. At 19, she'd married William Edison, a man with dreams bigger than Ohio could hold. He'd talked of California gold and Oregon timber, but they'd made it only as far as Arizona before running out of money and momentum. They'd scraped together enough for a small spread 40 acres of scrub and hope, a few cattle, and plans for more. The horse thieves came at dawn on a Tuesday. William had gone to the barn to milk their only cow. The shots echoed across the desert like thunder, and by the time Florence reached him, the thieves were dust on the horizon, and William was breathing his last into the morning air. She'd sold everything in 2 months. The cattle went first, then the land, then every piece of furniture that wouldn't fit in a single trunk. The silver watch that had been her mother's brought enough for stage fare to Boston, where a cousin had promised work in a millinery shop. But promises, Florence had learned, were as fragile as desert flowers. Now she sat in Sarah Turner's boarding house, mending a torn petticoat by lamplight, trying not to think about how few coins remained in her purse. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms full of fabric. "Some of the men need mending done," she said, dumping the pile on Florence's bed. Work shirts, mostly. A few pants. I told them you were handy with a needle saw, how neat you keep your own things. $1 a week if you're interested. Plus whatever extra folks want done. Florence fingered the rough fabric. Honest work, even if it wasn't what she'd imagined for herself. Thank you. I accept. Good. Now come down for supper before it gets cold. And Florence, Teddy Roosevelt's down there, trying to pretend he ain't watching the stairs. Florence found him indeed at a corner table, studying his coffee with intense concentration. The other diners, a mix of miners, merchants, and travelers, filled the room with tobacco smoke and conversation. She took a seat at the communal table, nodding to the others. Mrs. Edison. A woman her own age extended a hand. I'm Mary Sacagawea. I teach at the school. Despite her famous name, she explained she was Dakota, not Shoshone, adopted by missionaries who'd had romantic notions about names. The conversation flowed easily. Benjamin Curie, who ran the assay office despite his French accent and tales of Paris, complained about the quality of ore coming from the local mines. Esteban Hidalgo, the water hauler from Sonora, worried about the dropping water table. The old spring, she getting weak, he said in accented English. 20 years I haul water, never seen so low. Florence listened, learning the rhythms of her new home. When the meal ended, she gathered the work shirt Sarah had brought. Teddy Roosevelt appeared at her elbow, hat in hand. Mrs. Edison, I wondered, that is, I have some shirts need mending, if you're taking in work. She looked at the 2 shirts he produced, clearly his best ones, and barely worn. One had a tiny tear at the shoulder, something he could have fixed himself with 3 stitches. Of course. Mr. Roosevelt, when do you need them? No rush, ma'am. Whenever convenient. He paused. I also wanted to say, if you need supplies, thread, needles, such, I'm heading to Prescott day after tomorrow. Be happy to bring back whatever you need. That's kind of you. She named a few items, watching him carefully note each one. His hands, she noticed, were scarred across the knuckles, old wounds, long healed. Over the following days, Florence settled into a routine. Mornings she spent mending, her fingers flying through familiar motions. Afternoons she helped Sarah with the boarding house work, learning the domestic economy of a frontier town. Evenings she walked the dusty streets, memorizing the layout telegraph office, general store, blacksmith, saloon, church. The saloon ace's high worried her most. She'd seen what drink and cards could do to men far from home. The proprietor, Andrew Carnegie, who claimed no relation to the steel magnate but enjoyed the association, ran poker games that went till dawn. She glimpsed him once through the doors, a thin man with a gambler's smile and cold eyes. The work came steadily. Word spread that the widow Edison's stitches held firm, her patches nearly invisible. Soon she had more than shirts, canvas pants, leather vests, even a few Sunday dresses from the married women. Teddy appeared regularly, always with some small item needing repair. They developed a ritual. He'd knock. She'd answer. They'd discuss the work with serious attention while both tried to ignore the obvious fact that he could have mended these things himself. Torn my vest, he said one evening, displaying a garment that looked deliberately damaged. How unfortunate, Florence replied, matching his serious tone. Wild horses again? Cactus, he said solemnly. Jumped right out at me. She bit back a smile, taking the vest. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Teddy jerked back as if burned, mumbling his familiar refrain about never touching ladies. Mr. Roosevelt, she said gently, you've helped me carry water twice this week. Surely that required some touching. His face went crimson. That's different. That's just helping. And what's this? She gestured at the space between them. He opened his mouth, closed it, then fled with a muttered promise to return for the vest later. Mary Sacagawea, who'd witnessed the exchange from the porch, laughed softly. That man's got it bad. You know he was wild once, came here from Texas after some trouble. Been living like a monk ever since. Like he's doing penance. Florence thought of her own penance, the months of grief, the closed door in Boston, the weight of starting over. We all have our histories. True enough, but history doesn't have to be a prison. That night, Florence examined Teddy's vest more carefully. The tear was definitely deliberate, but she noticed something else. A hidden pocket sewn into the lining, the stitching far finer than his usual work. Inside was a photograph of a woman, worn soft with handling. On the back, in faded ink, "Forgive me, T." She replaced the photograph carefully, mended the tear, and reinforced the hidden pocket stitching. Some secrets deserved keeping. The next morning brought trouble. Raised voices in the street drew everyone outside. John Sherman, the bank owner, argued with Carnegie about a land deal gone wrong. Sheriff Pinkerton, a man who owed his position more to Carnegie's influence than any skill with a badge, stood by, clearly unsure which side to take. "The deed's legal," Sherman insisted, "witnessed and filed." Carnegie's smile never wavered. "Legal's a flexible word out here. Friend, ask anyone." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Florence noticed how the townspeople drew back, unwilling to involve themselves. Even Sarah Turner, usually fearless, found reason to retreat indoors. Only Teddy stepped forward. "Problem, gentlemen?" Carnegie's eyes narrowed. "No problem. Roosevelt. Just explaining to Mr. Sherman how business works in Gila Crossing." "I know how business works," Teddy said quietly. "Freight goes from here to there. People pay fair prices. Everyone goes home safe." "Not everyone," Carnegie said, still smiling. "Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes they pay for them." The moment stretched taut. Then Sherman backed down, muttering about needing to check his paperwork. Carnegie tipped his hat and strolled back to the saloon. Pinkerton followed like a trained dog. Teddy remained in the street, watching them go. When he turned, he found Florence beside him. "That was brave," she said. "That was stupid." He wiped sweat from his brow. "Carnegie's got plans, big ones, and he doesn't like obstacles." "What kind of plans?" Teddy glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Water rights. There's a cattleman named Rockefeller calls himself a baron, if you can believe it, buying up land around the old Escondida Spring. Between him and Carnegie, they could control every drop of water for 50 miles. Florence thought of Esteban's worried words about the falling water table. In the desert, who controlled water-controlled life itself. "Someone should stop them." "With what?" Teddy's laugh was bitter. "Law's whatever Pinkerton says it is, and Carnegie owns Pinkerton." That evening, Florence delivered Teddy's mended vest. He accepted it gravely, then surprised her by inviting her to see something. They walked to the edge of town, where his freight wagon sat loaded for the morning run. "Look there." He pointed to the horizon, where the last light painted the mountains purple. "Beautiful. Isn't it makes a man forget the ugly parts?" "Is that why you stay the beauty?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I stay because I gave my word, to myself, mostly, that I'd live straight, work honest, not let the past poison the future." "The woman in the photograph," he started, hand moving instinctively to his vest. Then his shoulders sagged. "You saw, I figured you might." He took a breath. "Margaret, my sister, she died because of something I did. Bar fight in El Paso, man pulled a knife. I hit him with a bottle. He went down wrong, hit his head on the stone floor." Florence waited. "His brothers came for revenge. Found our farm when I wasn't there. Margaret was alone." His voice went flat. "I was 17, full of spit and pride. Got her hurt for it." "You were a child," Florence said softly. "Old enough to know better, old enough to throw that bottle." He looked at her then, eyes full of old pain. "That's why I don't touch ladies. Mrs. Edison, I don't trust my hands. Don't trust myself not to bring harm. Florence thought of her own guilt, how she'd begged William to leave Ohio, pushed for the adventure that ultimately killed him, how she'd stood frozen while the shots rang out, unable to move, unable to help. We all carry our dead, she said finally. The question is whether we let them steer our lives. They stood together as darkness settled over the desert. Two people bound by loss and the strange intimacy of shared confession. In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another. The sound was lonely, but not hopeless creatures finding each other across the vast dark. I should get you back. Teddy said, not proper, being out here alone. No, Florence agreed. Not proper at all. But she smiled when she said it, and he almost smiled back. And for a moment the weight of their histories seemed lighter. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, Carnegie's schemes, Rockefeller's greed, the endless struggle for water and survival. Tonight, though, they walked back through the quiet streets of Gila Crossing, careful not to touch, but somehow closer than before. The stars emerged one by one, mapping out possibilities neither dared name. Not yet. Dawn came early to Gila Crossing, painting the saguaro cacti in shades of copper and gold. Teddy Roosevelt led Florence through the awakening town, pointing out the landmarks that define daily life in this harsh corner of the world. That's the community well, he said, gesturing to a stone-ringed hole where women already gathered with buckets. Dug by the first settlers 20 years back. Water's sweet, but getting lower every year. They passed the irrigation ditches that channeled precious water from the Escondida spring to small garden plots. Florence noticed how carefully measured each flow was, how neighbors watched to ensure fair distribution. And there, Teddy pointed to a ramshackle building. That's where folks stable their horses. Mine are the two bays in the back, Moses and Aaron, gentle as lambs, unless you try to shoe them. Florence found herself smiling at his obvious affection for the animals. They continued to the small schoolhouse where Mary Sacagawea was already preparing lessons, writing vocabulary words on a slate board. Through the window, Florence saw children of every shade, Mexican, Native, Chinese, white, all learning together. Mary does good work, Teddy observed. Teaches anyone who wants to learn, no matter what some folks say about it. The general store came next, run by Thomas Bell, a Scotsman who'd somehow ended up in Arizona with a stock of goods and an ear for gossip. His wife, Susan Anthony, no relation to the suffragist. She always clarified, kept the accounts with mathematical precision. Hey, Mrs. Edison, Susan called out. I have 3 ladies asking about your needlework. Seems you're developing quite a reputation. Florence accepted the compliments graciously. Though her mind was on practical matters, more work meant more security, more distance from the desperation that had driven her west. As they circled back toward the boarding house, they encountered Esteban Hidalgo wrestling with his water wagon. One wheel had cracked, and water seeped steadily from the barrel. Senora Edison, Senor Roosevelt. He greeted them, worry creasing his weathered face. This wheel, she finally give up. And the spring, he shook his head. Yesterday, barely enough to fill 1 barrel. Usually, I fill 3. Teddy examined the damage with practiced eyes. I can help you fix this, Esteban, but the spring that's bigger trouble. See, and now I hear Senor Rockefeller wants to build a dam, private dam, for his cattle only. Esteban spat in the dust. What about the rest of us, eh? Florence helped steady the wagon while the men worked. She noticed how naturally Teddy took charge, directing the repair with quiet competence. When they finished, Esteban insisted on giving them each a cup of cool water from his remaining supply, a generous gesture in a land where water was currency. The rest of the morning, Florence spent on needlework, establishing herself in Sarah's front parlor where potential customers could find her. Her fingers moved automatically through familiar motions while her mind wandered. Sarah brought coffee and gossip. That Carnegie's been busy. Saw him talking with Judge Vanderbilt yesterday, you know. The one who owns half the county. Something's brewing. Florence thought of Carnegie's cold smile, the way Sheriff Pinkerton followed him like a shadow. Nothing good, I imagine. Nothing good at all. Sarah lowered her voice. Benjamin at the assay office says Carnegie's been asking about mineral rights along the spring. Might be more than water thereafter. The afternoon brought unexpected entertainment. A young vaquero had acquired a wild Mustang and attempted to break it in the main street. The horse, a magnificent creature the color of storm clouds, had other ideas. Florence joined the crowd watching as the horse bucked and spun, sending the vaquero flying into a water trough. Children laughed and cheered. Even grave Mary Sacagawea smiled behind her hand. Then Teddy stepped forward. Mind if I try? The vaquero, dripping and bruised, gestured expansively. Be my guest, senor. This devil horse, he likes no one. What followed was less battle than dance. Teddy approached slowly, speaking in low tones Florence couldn't catch. The Mustang snorted, ears pinned back but didn't bolt, step by careful step. Teddy closed the distance. He's going to get himself killed, someone muttered. But Teddy kept talking, kept moving with deliberate calm. When he finally touched the horse's neck, the animal shuddered but stood still. Within minutes, Teddy had a hand on its mane, stroking gently. I'll be damned, Benjamin Curie said. Never seen the like. Then the horse decided it had cooperated enough. It reared suddenly, front hooves pawing air. Teddy lost his balance, landing hard in the dust. The Mustang trotted away, tail high, clearly pleased with itself. Florence found herself running forward before she thought, Are you hurt? Teddy sat up, grinning ruefully. Only my pride, ma'am. Then, realizing she had her hands on his shoulders, checking for injury, his face went scarlet. I've never touched a lady. Yes, I know. But Florence was laughing, and after a moment, so was he. The crowd dispersed, still chuckling, leaving them sitting in the dust like children. You have a way with horses, Florence said, helping him stand. Easier than people. He repeated his old line, but this time with warmth. Horses are honest. They tell you what they think right off. They dusted themselves off, aware of amused looks from passers-by. Florence didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely lighthearted. The weekly market occupied Saturday morning. Farmers and traders set up stalls in the square, selling everything from Chinese herbs to Mexican candy. Florence purchased thread from Wing Lee, whose small daughter helped translate prices. She bought dried apples from a Mormon family passing through and a small cactus honey cake from Esperanza Hidalgo, Esteban's wife. Good for the throat, Esperanza said in careful English. My grandmother's recipe. Teddy appeared with a small package. For your sewing, he said, handing it over. Inside was a set of fine steel needles, far better than anything available locally. These must have cost. Fair payment for fair work, he interrupted. A craftsman needs good tools. She wanted to protest the expense, but saw in his eyes that this mattered to him, this ability to provide something useful, something that acknowledged her skill. Thank you, she said simply. They walked through the market together, comfortable in shared silence. At a leather goods stall, Florence spotted something that made her pause. A set of silver buttons carved with birds in flight. Pretty, Teddy commented. They remind me of home. We had meadowlarks in Ohio. She touched one button gently. William loved their song. Teddy absorbed this rare mention of her husband without comment. After a moment, he bought the buttons and pressed them into her hand. For something special, he said. When you're ready. That evening, the town gathered at the church for a social. These monthly events were the heartbeat of community life, part dance, part meeting, part celebration of surviving another month in unforgiving land. Florence wore her best dress, the one she'd saved for Boston. It seemed foolish now, that careful preservation of something meant for a life that had rejected her. She sewed one of the bird buttons at her throat, a small decoration that caught the lamplight. The church hall buzzed with conversation in 3 languages. Esperanza had brought tamales. Susan Bell contributed shortbread. Sarah Turner arrived with 2 pies that disappeared within minutes. Mary Sacagawea played the small organ while couples danced. Mrs. Edison. Andrew Carnegie materialized at her elbow, smooth as oil. "I hear you're quite accomplished with a needle." "I manage." Florence replied carefully. Modesty. Charming. His smile never touched his eyes. "I might have work for someone with your skills. Special work, well paid." Before Florence could respond, Teddy appeared. "Evening, Carnegie." Roosevelt. The temperature seemed to drop. "Enjoying the social?" "Always do. Community events bring out the best in folks." Teddy's tone was mild, but he positioned himself slightly between Florence and Carnegie. Carnegie's smile widened. "Indeed, though some folks seem to forget their place in the community. That can be unfortunate." He drifted away, leaving unease in his wake. Florence noticed Sheriff Pinkerton by the door, watching everything with dull attention. "What kind of special work would he want?" she asked. "Nothing good. Carnegie doesn't do anything without profit in mind." Teddy hesitated. Would you care to dance?" The question clearly cost him effort. Florence could see others watching, curious about the widow and the careful freight driver. "I'd be honored," she said. They moved awkwardly at first, Teddy holding her as if she might shatter, but gradually they found a rhythm, turning slowly while Mary played a waltz she'd learned at mission school. "I'm not much of a dancer," Teddy apologized. "Neither am I." Florence smiled up at him. "We match well." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a possibility. For 3 minutes, they moved together in simple harmony, the rest of the room fading away. When the music ended, they stepped apart reluctantly. Florence noticed Mary's knowing smile, Sarah's approving nod, Carnegie's calculating stare. Outside, the desert night was crisp with stars. Groups walked home together for safety, voices carrying across the still air. Teddy escorted Florence to the boarding house, both aware they were prolonging the evening. "Thank you for the dance," Florence said at the door. "Thank you for accepting." He touched his hat brim, started to leave, then turned back. "Florence, Mrs. Edison, I want you to know, if Carnegie troubles you, or anyone else, I'm here." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The word hung between them like a promise. "I know," she said softly. "Good night, Teddy." She watched him walk away. This careful man who broke horses with whispers and held her like spun glass. In her room, she unwrapped the silver needles, running her finger along their perfect points. Tools for building, for mending, for creating something lasting in a world that seemed determined to tear things apart. Through her window, she could see the outline of the mountains, the scattered lights of town, the vast darkness of the desert. Somewhere out there, water tables dropped and powerful men made plans. But here, tonight, she had danced in a church hall and been called by her name. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The rumors spread through Gila Crossing like wildfire in dry grass. Cornelius Rockefeller, the self-styled cattle baron who owned the largest ranch in the territory, had been quietly buying land parcels around the Escondida Spring. His offers were generous to those who sold willingly, but those who refused found their water rights mysteriously challenged in court. Florence first heard the details from Susan Bell at the general store. "The Lopez family sold yesterday," Susan whispered, glancing around nervously. "Said they had no choice after their well went dry and Rockefeller offered them water access only if they sold." "That's extortion," Florence said. That's business, according to Judge Vanderbilt. Susan's mouth twisted bitterly. Funny how the judge always rules in favor of whoever pays best. The situation worsened when the rains came late and wrong, instead of the steady soaking the land needed. Violent thunderstorms tore through the valley, flash floods scouring the irrigation ditches and leaving mud where water should flow. The community well dropped another foot. Esteban's daily water runs became rationing sessions, with families limited to 2 buckets each. Florence witnessed the first death 3 weeks later. An old prospector's mule collapsed from thirst at the edge of town. Within days, smaller farms began losing chickens, goats, anything that couldn't survive on minimal water. At the boarding house, Sarah Turner implemented strict conservation. "Washing water gets used 3 times, she announced. "First for bodies, then clothes, then floors. Anyone who wastes a drop answers to me." The tension affected everyone. Tempers flared in the heat. 2 miners fought over accusations of water theft, leaving one with a broken jaw. Mary Sacagawea's school attendance dropped as families kept children home to help haul water from increasingly distant sources. Through it all, Florence noticed Teddy watching, planning. He altered his freight routes to bring back water barrels from Prescott, distributing them at cost despite the extra effort. She caught him several times studying maps by lamplight, tracing the watershed with one scarred finger. One evening, she found him at the stable, preparing for another supply run. His expression was grim. "Rockefeller started construction," he said without preamble. "Private dam across the Escondida. Carnegie's supplying the capital. Pinkerton's providing the security. They're calling it perfectly legal." How can damming a community water source be legal? Because Rockefeller bought the land around it, according to Vanderbilt's interpretation of territorial law. That gives him rights to improve the water flow. Teddy's jaw tightened. By improvement, they mean charging everyone downstream for what used to be free. Florence felt a cold anger settle in her chest. "There must be something we can do." Benjamin's been checking the surveys. There might be irregularities in the land purchases, but proving it, he shrugged helplessly. "We'd need a lawyer, witnesses willing to testify, a judge who isn't bought." That night, Florence sat in Sarah's parlor, ostensibly mending but actually eavesdropping on the saloon across the street. The windows were open against the heat, and voices carried clearly. "A railroad survey next month." Carnegie's smooth tone drifted out. "Perfect timing with the water rights." Sheriff Pinkerton's rougher voice responded. "Workers getting restless about pay. That's your problem to solve." Carnegie said, "I suggest you find some troublemakers to blame. The Mexican community is always convenient." Florence's hands stilled on her sewing. She grabbed her journal and began writing, documenting every word she could catch. When Teddy stopped by later to collect a mended shirt, she showed him her notes. His face darkened as he read. "They're planning something, using the payroll as bait." "The mine payroll comes through next week," Florence said. "You're scheduled to guard that shipment." He nodded slowly. "And if something happens to it, if someone they can blame is conveniently nearby." "They kill 2 birds," Florence finished. "Create unrest between communities and justify their private security force." Teddy studied her with something like admiration. "You've got a strategic mind. Florence Edison." "I've learned to pay attention," she replied. "Question is, what do we do about it?" The next few days passed intense preparation. Teddy quietly warned the Mexican families to stay visible and accounted for on payroll day. Mary Sacagawea organized the women to witness and document everyone's whereabouts. Benjamin Curie used his connections to verify the exact route and timing of the shipment. Florence, meanwhile, accepted Carnegie's offer of special work, repairing some elaborate costumes he claimed were for a theatrical troupe. She knew better but needed access to information. Working in a back room of the saloon, she overheard enough to confirm their suspicions. The Roosevelt boys getting too curious. Pinkerton said one afternoon, not knowing Florence was within earshot. Might need an accident. Nothing traceable. Carnegie replied, "We need this to look like revolutionary activity, not personal vendetta. Besides, martyrs are inconvenient. Better to discredit than eliminate." Florence's hands trembled as she stitched, but she forced herself to continue working, gathering intelligence with each overheard conversation. The night before the payroll run, Teddy made his rounds, checking equipment with unusual care. Florence met him at the stable, bringing the small medical kit she'd assembled. "You shouldn't come tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "Whatever happens, I don't want you caught in it." "I'm already caught in it," she replied, tucking the kit into his saddlebag. "We all are." He turned to face her then, and she saw the weight he carried a responsibility for the shipment, for the community, for her. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble, the warmth of skin. He froze, then slowly, carefully, covered her hand with his. "Florence, I—" A sound outside made them both start. Teddy grabbed his rifle, pushing Florence behind him. But it was only Esteban, leading his water wagon for the morning fill. "Senor Roosevelt," he called softly, "I have information. My cousin saw men camping in Coyote Canyon, men with guns, waiting." "The ambush site?" Teddy nodded grimly. "How many?" "6, maybe 7. They have good positions in the rocks." Florence's mind raced. "What if we change the route?" "They'll adapt." Teddy said, "These aren't amateurs." "Then we need witnesses," she said. "Respectable ones. People whose word can't be easily dismissed." They worked through the night, quietly spreading word. When dawn broke and Teddy's freight wagon rolled out of town, it looked like any other run. But hidden in the mesquite and riding parallel routes were townspeople Susan Bell and her husband, Benjamin Curie, even Mary Sacagawea, who'd closed school for the day. Florence watched them go from the boarding house roof, Sarah Turner beside her with an old spyglass. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and blood. "There," Sarah pointed. "Dust cloud from the canyon." The ambush came exactly where Esteban had warned. Florence saw the flashes of gunfire, heard the distant popping sounds. Her heart clenched as the freight wagon lurched, one wheel damaged. But Teddy was ready. Instead of stopping, he urged the horses into the shelter of a rock formation. Return fire came from unexpected angles as the hidden townspeople revealed themselves, catching the ambushers in a crossfire of witnesses, if not bullets. Florence saw a smaller figure the young apprentice Teddy had hired fall from the wagon. Without thinking, she was running, Sarah's shouts fading behind her. She reached the edge of town as the firefight was ending, the ambushers retreating under the weight of too many witnesses. Teddy knelt by the apprentice, a boy of 15 named Thomas Alva, who'd come west seeking adventure and found more than he'd bargained for. Blood seeped through the boy's shirt, but he was conscious, eyes wide with shock. "You're all right," Teddy said firmly, pressing a bandage to the wound. "Just a graze. You'll have a scar to impress the girls." Florence dropped beside them, opening her medical kit with steady hands. Together, they cleaned and bound the wound while the other townspeople secured the scene. Among the scattered evidence, Benjamin found something crucial, a telegram draft in Pinkerton's handwriting, detailing the planned ambush. "Fool must have dropped it in the excitement," Benjamin said with satisfaction. "This alone could hang them." But when they returned to town, Sheriff Pinkerton was waiting with a different story. "Attempted robbery by Mexican revolutionaries," he announced to the gathering crowd. "Good thing my deputized men were nearby to drive them off." "Your men were the robbers." Susan Bell stepped forward, dusty but determined. "We all saw it. We have evidence." Pinkerton's smile was unpleasant. The word of hysterical women and foreign agitators against sworn lawmen. The crowd stirred uneasily. This was the crucial moment. Florence realized either the community would unite or fracture along the lines Carnegie and Rockefeller had drawn. Then Teddy stood, supporting the wounded Thomas Alva. His voice carried across the square with quiet authority. "I've hauled freight through Apache territory, through flash floods and droughts. Never lost a shipment until men wearing badges tried to take it. Every person here knows my word is good. I say Sheriff Pinkerton arranged this ambush, and I have proof." He held up the telegram draft. Pinkerton's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped as he realized dozens of armed citizens were watching. The moment stretched taut as a fiddle string. "Seems we need a new sheriff." Someone called from the crowd. Others took up the cry. Pinkerton. Seeing the tide turn, back toward the saloon where Carnegie waited. But the damage was done. The payroll was safe. The ambush exposed. And most importantly, the community had refused to turn on itself. As Florence helped Thomas Alva to the doctor's office, she felt something shift in the desert air. The war for water wasn't over, but the first battle had been won. That night, Teddy found her on the boarding house porch. He was dusty, exhausted, favoring his left side where a bullet had grazed his ribs. Without a word, Florence led him inside and tended the wound, her hands gentle but sure. "You saved that boy's life," she said quietly. "We saved it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done it without your kit, your planning." He caught her hand, holding it carefully. "Florence, I need to tell you something. Today, when those bullets were flying, all I could think about was whether I'd ever get the chance to say—" She waited, heart hammering. "I love you," he said simply. "I know I have no right, with my past and my rough ways. But I needed you to know. In case tomorrow—" "Tomorrow we face whatever comes," Florence interrupted. "Together." This time, when he reached for her, there was no hesitation. His kiss was careful, reverent, as if she were indeed made of spun glass. But Florence was tired of being careful. She pulled him closer, pouring all her own unspoken feelings into the moment. When they finally parted, both breathless, Teddy's eyes held wonder. "I thought I'd forgotten how to hope," he said. "Then I'll remind you," Florence promised, "every day if necessary." Outside, Gila Crossing settled into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Rockefeller's dam, Carnegie's schemes, the endless struggle for water and justice. But tonight, two wounded souls had found healing in each other. The war was far from over, but now, at least, they wouldn't fight it alone. The aftermath of the failed ambush sent ripples through Gila Crossing like stones in still water. Sheriff Pinkerton, his authority undermined, became increasingly aggressive. He posted new ordinances, daily curfews for suspicious persons, permits required for public gatherings, restrictions on water usage that somehow never applied to Rockefeller's ranch or Carnegie's saloon. Florence found herself under particular scrutiny. As an unmarried woman who'd involved herself in men's business, she became a target for both official harassment and ugly whispers. "Heard she's been sneaking around with that Roosevelt fellow?" Florence overheard one woman say at the general store. "No wonder her husband died, probably drove him to it with her unnatural ways." The word stung more than Florence cared to admit. She'd thought the community's unity during the ambush meant acceptance, but old prejudices died hard. Some folks who'd stood with them against Pinkerton now crossed the street to avoid her. Sarah Turner, fierce as always, had no patience for such talk. "Cowards and fools," she declared, loud enough for the gossips to hear. "That woman's got more courage in her little finger than most folks have in their whole body." But Florence felt the isolation keenly. Orders for sewing work dropped off. Women who'd been friendly now kept their distance, even at church. She found herself sitting alone while whispers followed her like dust devils. The pressure took its toll on Teddy, too. Rockefeller's men began following his freight runs, looking for any excuse to cause trouble. They spooked his horses, damaged wagon wheels, spread rumors that he was transporting illegal goods. One evening, Florence found him in the stable, slumped on a hay bale with his head in his hands. His shirt was torn, knuckles bloodied. What happened? She knelt beside him, reaching for his injured hand. He jerked away. Don't! People are watching. They'll talk more. Let them talk. She grabbed his hand firmly, examining the damage. Who did this? Doesn't matter. His voice was flat, defeated. Florence, maybe you should take that job in Prescott, the one Mary mentioned. Get away from here. From me. Is that what you want? He looked at her then, eyes full of anguish. I want you safe. I want you to have a life without people spitting when you walk by. His voice broke. I want things I have no right to want. Florence felt her own temper rise not at him, but at the forces trying to break them. Theodore Roosevelt, you listen to me. I didn't survive losing my husband, crossing the desert, and facing down gunmen just to run because some small-minded people wagged their tongues. And I certainly didn't do it to let you push me away out of misguided nobility. She pulled out her sewing kit and began cleaning his knuckles with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she used for mending. Now tell me who did this. Pinkerton's new deputies said I was disturbing the peace by existing. He winced as she applied iodine. They're pushing. Florence, wanting me to fight back, give them an excuse to arrest me or worse. Then we don't give them that excuse. She wrapped his hand carefully. We're smarter than they are. Are we? Teddy's laugh was bitter. They have the law, the money, the guns. What do we have? Each other, Florence said firmly. And the truth, and friends, even if some are fair-weather ones. That night, Florence made a decision. If the town wanted to treat her like a pariah, she'd use it. Outcasts could go places respectable women couldn't, hear things good women weren't supposed to hear. She started with the saloon, walking through the doors in broad daylight. The room fell silent, every eye turning to stare. Carnegie, playing cards at his usual table, smiled like a cat with cream. Mrs. Edison, how unexpected. Mr. Carnegie, she kept her voice level. I've reconsidered your offer of special work, if it's still available. His eyes glittered with interest. Indeed, and what brought about this change of heart? Empty pockets and closed doors, she said truthfully. Seems my reputation has become complicated. A reputation is such a fragile thing. Carnegie agreed. Please, sit. Let's discuss terms. The work he offered was perfectly legitimate on the surface, mending costumes, creating elaborate dresses for the entertainment he was bringing to town. But it required her presence in the saloon's back rooms where she could observe and listen. Teddy was furious when he found out. You can't be serious. That place, those men talk when they drink, Florence interrupted. And they drink a lot around women they think don't matter. I won't let you. Let me? Florence's eyes flashed. Theodore Roosevelt, if you finish that sentence, I'll show you exactly what kind of woman I am, and it won't be the delicate flower you seem to think needs protecting. They faced each other in Sarah's kitchen, the air between them electric with tension. Then Teddy's shoulders sagged. I'm sorry, you're right. I can't lose you too. Florence, I can't. Her anger melted. She touched his face gently. You won't, but we can't fight this by playing their game. We need to be smarter. Over the following weeks, Florence became a ghost in plain sight. She worked in the saloon, invisible to men who saw her as furniture. She documented every conversation, every plan, every casual admission of guilt. She learned that Rockefeller's dam was nearly complete, built with substandard materials to maximize profit. She discovered that Judge Vanderbilt had taken bribes to approve water rights that violated territorial law. Most damning. She overheard Carnegie discussing plans to dynamite the old community well. blaming it on Mexican saboteurs to justify martial law. Meanwhile, Teddy worked with Benjamin Curie and Esteban Hidalgo to document the original Spanish and Mexican land grants that predated Rockefeller's claims. Mary Sacagawea used her connections with tribal elders to gather oral histories about traditional water rights. The tension in town grew thick as summer dust. The community well dropped to critical levels. Rockefeller announced his water prices 10 times what families could afford. Some began talking about leaving. Others spoke of violence. The breaking point came when Esperanza Hidalgo's baby fell ill from dehydration. The family had no money for Rockefeller's water, and the community well was nearly dry. Florence found Esperanza crying at the church, the infant listless in her arms. Without hesitation, Florence gave her all the money she'd saved from Carnegie's work. "For water," she said, "as much as you need." Word spread quickly. By evening, a line of desperate families stood at Florence's door. She gave until her purse was empty, knowing it was only a temporary solution. That night, she found Teddy at their usual meeting spot, a grove of cottonwoods by the dry riverbed. His face was grim. "It's starting," he said. "Some of the miners are talking about blowing Rockefeller's dam. The Mexican families are organizing a march on the sheriff's office. Everyone's choosing sides." "That's what they want," Florence said. "Chaos they can use to justify anything." She pulled out her notebook, showing him the accumulated evidence. "But what if we gave them something else?" They worked through the night, planning. By dawn, they had a strategy that might save the town or destroy them trying. The next morning, Florence walked into the saloon and announced loudly, "Mr. Carnegie, I quit. Your money's as dirty as your conscience, and I won't take another cent." Carnegie's face darkened. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Edison." "I doubt it." She turned to the room full of morning drinkers. "Any of you men have wives or children going thirsty while you drink whiskey bought with their suffering? Shame on you. And shame on any woman who stands by and lets it happen." She walked out, head high, knowing she'd just painted a target on her back. But she'd also fired the first shot in a different kind of war, one fought with truth instead of bullets. Within hours, the women of Gila Crossing began to mobilize. Led by Sarah Turner and Susan Bell, they organized a water-sharing system that bypassed Rockefeller's control. Families with access shared with those without. Hidden cisterns were opened. Ancient knowledge of desert water sources was revived. Pinkerton tried to stop them, but arresting women for sharing water was too much even for bought lawmen. The deputies hesitated, giving the movement time to grow. Carnegie made his move that night. Florence, walking back from delivering water to the Hidalgo family, sensed the trap too late. 3 men emerged from the shadows, Pinkerton's deputies with violence in their eyes. "Seems you need a lesson in proper behavior, woman." She ran, but they were faster. Hands grabbed her, dragged her toward a dark alley. She fought with everything William had taught her about survival, but 3 against 1 were bad odds. Then Teddy was there, erupting from the darkness like an avenging angel. The fight was brutal, quick. When it ended, 2 deputies were unconscious and the 3rd was running. Teddy stood panting, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her, checking for injury. "No." She was shaking but whole. "How did you know?" "I've been watching every night. Couldn't let you walk alone, no matter what you said about not needing protection." He pulled her close, and she felt him trembling too. "Florence, we can't keep this up. It's escalating too fast." She thought of Esperanza's baby, of the families choosing between water and food, of the community tearing itself apart. "Then we end it. Tomorrow. All or nothing." They gathered their allies in the church, the only neutral ground left. Benjamin laid out the evidence they'd collected. Mary presented the historical documents. Florence shared her notebook of overheard crimes. "It's enough to take to the territorial governor," Benjamin said. "But we'd need someone to get it there safely. Someone they wouldn't suspect." "I'll go," Thomas Alva volunteered. The boy Florence and Teddy had saved was healed now, eager to help. "Too dangerous," Teddy said. "They'll be watching." A commotion outside interrupted him. Through the windows, they could see torches gathering. Carnegie's voice carried across the night. Time to clean out the rat's nest. The mob surged toward the church. Florence grabbed the documents, shoving them at Thomas. "Back door! Ride hard and don't stop!" The boy ran. The others prepared to defend the church, and Florence made a choice that would haunt her forever. She walked out the front door to face the mob alone. "Looking for me, Mr. Carnegie." The crowd paused, confused. Carnegie's smile was predatory. "Mrs. Edison, how convenient." "Let the others go," she said clearly. "I'm the one you want, the troublemaker, the woman who doesn't know her place." "Florence, no," Teddy's voice from the doorway. She didn't turn. "I'll come quietly. Public trial. Let me confess my crimes for all to hear." She met Carnegie's eyes. "Unless you're afraid of what I might say." It was a gamble. Carnegie couldn't kill her publicly without cause, but a trial would give her a platform. She saw him calculate, weigh options. "Take her," he ordered finally. "The rest of you disperse. Justice will be served." As Pinkerton's men bound her hands, Florence caught Teddy's eyes. "Trust me?" she mouthed. He nodded once, understanding. They locked her in the jail, a converted stable that stank of horse and fear. Through the barred window, she could see riders leaving town Thomas to the governor, others to spread word. Carnegie visited before dawn. "You've lost, you know. Even if that boy reaches Prescott, who'll believe him? A wounded woman's hysteria against respected businessmen." Florence smiled. "We'll see. You're remarkably calm for someone facing trial. I've already lost everything once. Mr. Carnegie, it's quite freeing. Really, nothing left to fear." His composure cracked slightly. "We'll see about that." But as he left, Florence saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Doubt. He'd won, but the victory felt uncertain. The town was too quiet, the resistance too easily overcome. Dawn broke gray and sullen. Through her window, Florence watched the town wake. No one went to work. No one opened shops. The entire population of Gila Crossing was converging on the courthouse. She smiled. The real trial was about to begin. The night brought no rest to Gila Crossing. Florence watched from her cell window as lanterns moved through the darkness like fireflies, people preparing for something more than just a trial. She could hear Sarah Turner's voice organizing the women, Benjamin Curie directing men to strategic positions, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of hammers on wood. When dawn finally came, Florence understood. The townsfolk had transformed the street outside the courthouse into an amphitheater. Rough benches filled every available space. A speaker's platform stood where everyone could see and hear. This wouldn't be Carnegie's quiet kangaroo court. This would be justice performed in daylight. Sheriff Pinkerton arrived to transfer her, clearly disturbed by the crowds. "What's all this?" "Democracy," Florence replied calmly. "You should try it sometime." He yanked her roughly from the cell, but as they emerged into the morning light, even he faltered. The entire population of Gila Crossing had gathered: miners, ranchers, merchants, Mexicans, Chinese, Indians, women, children, all silent, all watching. Teddy stood near the platform, his presence solid as the mountains. When their eyes met, he touched his chest once right over his heart. The gesture gave Florence strength as Pinkerton shoved her forward. Judge Vanderbilt, hastily summoned from his comfortable ranch, looked decidedly uncomfortable on the makeshift bench. Carnegie sat at the prosecutor's table, still confident but with an edge of uncertainty. The defense table remained empty. No lawyer would take Florence's case. "I'll defend myself," Florence announced, her voice carrying clearly. Vanderbilt frowned. "That's highly irregular. A woman." has the right to speak in her own defense. Florence interrupted. Unless Arizona territory has different laws than the United States. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vanderbilt, trapped by his own pretense of legality, had to agree. Carnegie stood to present charges. Florence Edison stands accused of inciting rebellion, disturbing the peace, conducting business without proper permits, and conspiracy to destroy private property. How do you plead? Vanderbilt asked. Florence rose slowly, making sure everyone could see her. I plead guilty to disturbing the peace of corruption and exploitation. I plead guilty to conducting business, the business of survival, in a town where water costs more than whiskey. As for conspiracy, she smiled. I plead guilty to conspiring with my neighbors to stay alive. The crowd stirred. Carnegie's face darkened. Your Honor, the defendant's mockery is no mockery. Florence continued. But let's discuss real crimes. Mr. Carnegie, is it true you plan to dynamite the community well? Objection! Carnegie shot to his feet. I'm not on trial here. Aren't you? Florence pulled out her notebook, somehow overlooked in her arrest. I have here your own words, spoken in your saloon. Shall I read them? What followed was a masterclass in reversal. Florence, denied proper legal procedure, turned the trial into a public hearing. She read conversations, presented evidence, named dates and times. Each revelation brought gasps from the crowd. Carnegie tried to stop her. These are lies hearsay. Then let's call witnesses. Florence turned to the crowd. Who here has been denied water unless they paid Rockefeller's prices? Dozens of hands rose. Who here has been threatened by Sheriff Pinkerton for disturbing the peace when they complained? More hands. Who here knows that the Escondida Spring has belonged to this community since before America claimed this land? Nearly everyone stood. Judge Vanderbilt pounded his gavel futilely. Order, this is not how trials are conducted. No, Sarah Turner called out. This is how justice is conducted? The crowd surged forward. Not violent, but insistent. Pinkerton's deputies fingered their weapons nervously, vastly outnumbered. Florence saw the moment when calculations shifted Carnegie, realizing he'd overplayed his hand. Then thunder rolled across the desert, though no clouds marked the sky. The ground trembled slightly. People looked around nervously as the sound came again. Closer. The dam! Esteban Hidalgo shouted, running into the square. Rockefeller's dam is breaking! Chaos erupted. The shoddy construction Carnegie had boasted about saving money on was failing under the pressure of backed-up water. If it collapsed completely, the flood would sweep through the lower valley where many Mexican families had their homes. My children! Esperanza Hidalgo screamed, running toward the danger. Without hesitation, people abandoned the trial. Teddy commanded rescue efforts, sending riders to warn downstream families. Mary Sacagawea organized evacuation of the schoolhouse. Even some of Pinkerton's deputies, faced with real emergency instead of manufactured law, joined the rescue. Florence found herself released in the confusion, her bonds cut by Benjamin Curie. Go, he said. Help where you can. She ran toward the threatened area, finding Teddy already directing men to dig diversion channels. The dam groaned ominously, water spurting through growing cracks. We need to control the release. Teddy shouted over the noise. If it goes all at once... The construction supplies. Florence said suddenly. Carnegie stockpiled dynamite for the well. We could use it to create controlled breaks. Teddy's eyes widened with understanding. Brilliant. But who knows how to... I do. A voice behind them made them turn. Andrew Carnegie stood there, his fine suit already dusty. I may be many things, but I'm not a murderer of children. It was a strange alliance, townsfolk and would-be oppressor working together against a greater threat. Carnegie directed the placement of charges with unexpected expertise. Teddy and the strongest men shifted rocks to create channels. Florence and the women evacuated the last families from the danger zone. The controlled explosions worked, instead of a catastrophic collapse. The dam broke in sections, water rushing through prepared channels. The flood was still dangerous, but manageable. By sunset, the crisis had passed. The town gathered again in the square, exhausted, muddy, but strangely unified. The shared danger had broken down barriers that laws and money had erected. Carnegie, his expensive clothes ruined, sat on the same rough bench as Esteban Hidalgo. Pinkerton's badge lay abandoned in the mud. Judge Vanderbilt tried to restore authority. "The trial must continue." "What trial?" Mary Sacagawea asked innocently. "I see no defendant. I see no sheriff. I see only neighbors who saved each other." Florence stepped forward. "Your Honor, I withdraw my plea, since the charges were based on laws that Sheriff Pinkerton has abandoned his post to enforce. And since the prosecutor has just proved his value to our community in other ways, I move that this matter be considered resolved." Vanderbilt looked around at hundreds of faces, all watching him. The smart play was obvious. Case dismissed for lack of prosecution. The crowd didn't cheer, they were too tired, too aware of how close they'd come to disaster. But something had shifted fundamentally. As people dispersed to check their homes and count their blessings, new patterns emerged. Carnegie's men helped Mexican families repair flood damage. Former enemies shared water and food. Florence found Teddy by the ruins of the dam, staring at the water now flowing freely into its old channels. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Rockefeller will be back. There'll be legal challenges, more schemes." "I know." She slipped her hand into his. "But look at what we did today. All of us, together. They can't fight that, not really." He pulled her close, heedless of the mud covering them both. "You were magnificent, turning that trial into, I don't even have words." "I was terrified," Florence admitted. "But then I saw you all there, and I knew." She paused, searching for words. "I knew I wasn't alone. That's their real weakness. You know, Carnegie, Rockefeller, all of them. They're alone. They have employees, servants, people they buy, but in the end, they're alone." As if summoned by his name, Carnegie appeared. He looked older, diminished, his usual swagger replaced by weariness. "I'm Mrs. Edison, Roosevelt." He nodded to each. "I suppose you expect an apology." "I expect nothing from you," Florence said evenly. "Good, because I'm not apologizing. I'm a businessman. I saw opportunity." He paused. "But I'm also not stupid. This town, it's not what I calculated. You're not what I calculated." "Meaning?" Teddy asked. "Meaning I'm cutting my losses. Rockefeller can find another partner for his schemes." Carnegie looked at the flowing water. "Did you know I grew up poor? So poor we fought over clean water in Scottish slums. I swore I'd never be that helpless again." "So you tried to make others helpless instead," Florence said. "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air. "Turns out that's no way to build anything lasting." He turned to go, then paused. "The dynamite in the storeroom? Consider it a parting gift. You'll need it for proper irrigation channels." He walked away, a smaller figure than the one who'd ruled from the saloon. Within a week, he'd sold his interests and left town, following the railroad to other opportunities. Sheriff Pinkerton disappeared the same night, leaving his badge and a half-written confession that implicated Judge Vanderbilt in numerous bribes. The judge himself retreated to his ranch, suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere. As the immediate crisis passed, the real work began. The community that had united against catastrophe now had to build something sustainable. They elected a new sheriff, Thomas Bell, the Scottish shopkeeper whose honesty was as legendary as his thrift. A council formed to manage water rights, with representatives from every group in town. Florence and Teddy worked side by side, helping to design new irrigation systems that served all equally. The shared labor brought them closer. their partnership deepening with each passing day. One evening, as they supervised channel digging near the Hidalgo farm, Esperanza approached with her baby healthy now, thriving with adequate water. "Senora Edison," she said shyly, "the women, we have been talking. You stood for us when it mattered. We want to stand for you too." She presented a beautiful shawl, embroidered with desert flowers. "For your wedding," Esperanza added with a knowing smile. "Whenever you are ready." Florence flushed, glancing at Teddy, who had suddenly become very interested in surveying equipment. "We haven't—" "No," Esperanza's eyes twinkled. "Then perhaps you should. Life is short, water is precious, and love is the rarest treasure of all." She left them alone in the deepening twilight. Teddy cleared his throat, still not looking at Florence directly. "She's not wrong," he said finally, "about life being short, about treasures." Florence waited, heart pounding. "I know I'm not much," Teddy continued, words coming faster now. "A freight driver with a violent past and hands that know more about horses than gentle things. But Florence, if you'd have me—" "Yes," she interrupted. He finally looked at her, wonder in his eyes. "You didn't let me finish. You were taking too long." She smiled through tears she hadn't expected. "Yes, Theodore Roosevelt. Yes to all of it. To building a life here. To facing whatever comes. To—" He kissed her then, there in the middle of the muddy irrigation ditch, with the sunset painting the desert gold and the sound of freely flowing water in their ears. It wasn't the proposal or setting either had imagined, but it was perfect for who they'd become. Two people who'd learned that paradise wasn't a place you found, but something you built. One shared struggle at a time. When they finally parted, both laughing at the mud they'd managed to transfer to each other's faces. The first stars were appearing. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh and beautiful in theirs. "We should tell Sarah," Florence said. "She'll want to plan a celebration." "Tomorrow," Teddy said, taking her hand. "Tonight, let's just be—" They walked back toward town together, fingers interlaced, steps matching. Behind them, water flowed through channels carved by community effort. Ahead, lights beckoned from homes that would weather whatever storms might come, because they would face them together. The fight for Gila Crossing wasn't over. There would be other challenges, other men who thought water and wealth gave them the right to rule. But tonight, Florence Edison and Teddy Roosevelt had won something more precious than any legal victory. They'd won the right to hope. The makeshift courthouse had been transformed from a warehouse into something resembling a hall of justice. Morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above the assembled crowd. Every bench, chair, and standing space was occupied by the citizens of Gila Crossing, their faces grave with the understanding that this day would determine their future. Reverend William Booth, the circuit preacher who'd arrived just in time for the proceedings, opened with a reading from territorial law about water rights and communal property. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too many frontier towns torn apart by greed. "Let those who would speak truth come forward," he intoned. The jury, 7 citizens chosen for their integrity, sat in mismatched chairs. There was Marcus Garvey, the elderly Buffalo soldier who'd settled here after the wars; Li Ming, whose family had helped build the railroad; Isabella Bird, the English widow who ran the boarding house with Sarah Turner; Jose Marti, spokesman for the Mexican community; Samuel Clemens, the assayer who'd replaced Benjamin Curie; Victoria Woodhull, the midwife who'd delivered half the town's children; and George Carver, the freedman who'd made the desert bloom with his experimental farming. Florence took the witness chair first, her journal in hand. The months of careful documentation now served as evidence. She read entries in a clear voice: dates, times, conversations overheard, schemes planned, laws broken. October 15th. Carnegie discusses with Pinkerton the need to remove obstacles. Names mentioned include Esteban Hidalgo and Teddy Roosevelt. November 3rd, Judge Vanderbilt promises to rule in favor of Rockefeller's water claims in exchange for a percentage of future profits. November the 20th, plans overheard to blame dam sabotage on Mexican revolutionaries to justify martial law. Each entry built the case methodically. When Carnegie's lawyer, a nervous young man from Prescott, tried to object, the crowd's murmurs silenced him more effectively than any gavel. Teddy testified next, his damaged hand evidence of the violence used to silence opposition. He spoke simply, factually, about ambushes, threats, and the systematic campaign to drive out anyone who opposed the water monopoly. "I've hauled freight through Apache territory," he said. "I've faced sandstorms that could strip skin from bone, but I've never seen anything as calculated cruel as denying water to children in the desert." One by one, others testified. Esperanza Hidalgo, holding her baby who'd nearly died of thirst. Thomas Alva, the young man who'd taken a bullet delivering the payroll. Mary Sacagawea, whose school had been threatened with closure for teaching radical ideas like equal rights to water. The most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. Martha Washington, Carnegie's own bookkeeper, stepped forward with ledgers showing bribes, falsified deeds, and planned violence. "I kept quiet out of fear," she admitted, voice shaking. "But when I saw neighbors helping each other during the flood, risking their lives for strangers, I couldn't stay silent anymore." The evidence was overwhelming. By noon, even Rockefeller's expensive lawyer couldn't maintain the pretense of innocence. The cattle baron himself sat rigid in his chair, his empire crumbling with each revelation. When it came time for the accused to speak, Pinkerton refused, glowering from behind the defendant's table. Carnegie, however, stood slowly. "You want me to apologize," he said, addressing the room. "To say I was wrong, but I did what every successful man does. I saw opportunity and seized it. The only difference between me and the heroes of industry you read about in Eastern papers is that I got caught." "No," Florence said, standing. "The difference is that we stopped you. A community standing together stopped you." Carnegie's smile was bitter. "This time, but there will be others. There always are. Men with money, influence, the law on their side. Then we'll stop them too," Sarah Turner called out, "every time." The jury didn't need long to deliberate. Marcus Garvey, chosen as foreman, delivered the verdict in his deep, measured voice. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the citizens of their water rights, guilty. On the charge of attempted destruction of community property, guilty. On the charge of incitement to violence, guilty. Judge Vanderbilt, brought from Prescott under territorial guard, had no choice but to accept the verdict. The sentences were just but not vengeful. Pinkerton faced imprisonment and permanent ban from law enforcement. Carnegie received heavy fines and forfeiture of all water claims. Rockefeller lost his dam and the illegally obtained land, which reverted to community ownership. Furthermore, Garvey continued, reading from the jury's recommendations, "We propose the establishment of a community water authority, with elected representatives from all groups, to manage our resources fairly and prevent future exploitation." The proposal passed by acclamation, as people filed out, planning celebration and future alike. Florence noticed Carnegie approaching. His fine clothes were dusty, his arrogance replaced by something almost like respect. "You played the long game," he said quietly. "All those months of listening, documenting, I underestimated you." "You underestimated all of us," Florence replied. "Perhaps." He glanced at Teddy, who stood protectively close. "Roosevelt, you've got yourself a formidable partner. Don't forget it." "Never," Teddy said simply. Carnegie left town that evening, his enterprises liquidated to pay fines and damages. Rockefeller followed within the week, his cattle empire relocated to less organized territories. The power vacuum they left was filled not by new exploiters, but by the community itself. A month later, the Community Water Authority held its first official meeting. The old saloon, purchased with Carnegie's fines, had been converted into a meeting hall. Maps covered the walls showing proposed irrigation channels, shared wells, and emergency reserves. Florence, elected secretary, kept careful minutes as the assembly voted on water allocations, maintenance schedules, and drought preparations. It was democracy in its purest form, messy, argumentative, but ultimately fair. After the meeting, she and Teddy walked to the site of their future home, a small plot near the new irrigation channels where they could build something lasting. The foundation was already laid, friends and neighbors having pitched in as wedding gifts. From warehouse to courthouse to community hall, Teddy mused, looking back at the transformed saloon. Buildings change based on how we use them. Like people, Florence said, thinking of her own transformation from grieving widow to community advocate. Like us, Teddy agreed, pulling her close. They stood together as the sun set, watching water flow through channels dug by communal effort. Children played along the banks, Mexican, Chinese, Indian, white, all equal inheritors of what they'd fought to preserve. You know what the best part is? Florence asked. What's that? We wrote it all down, every bit of it. The next time someone tries this here or anywhere, people will know how we fought back, how a community can stand against greed and win. Teddy smiled. The power of the pen. And the courage to use it, Florence added, as stars emerged in the desert sky. They made their way back to Sarah's boarding house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the wedding to plan, the house to build, the ongoing work of keeping their victory secure. But tonight, they'd earned their rest. The water flowed freely. The law served justice rather than power. And two people who'd found each other across loss and struggle could finally look forward instead of back. I love you, Teddy said suddenly, the words still new enough to surprise them both. I know, Florence replied, squeezing his hand. That's what gave me courage in that courtroom. Knowing you were there, knowing we all were there for each other. They reached the boarding house to find it blazing with light and laughter. The community celebration had spontaneously moved from the hall to Sarah's, where tables groaned with shared food and guitars filled the air with music. There they are, Mary Sacagawea called out. The heroes of the hour. Not heroes, Florence protested as they were swept into the party. Just neighbors. Same thing, Sarah Turner declared, pressing cups of sweet tea into their hands. In a place like this, being a good neighbor is the most heroic thing you can do. The party lasted until dawn. Stories shared and retold until they became legend. The trial of Gila Crossing would be remembered not for the guilt of powerful men, but for the courage of ordinary people who refused to be divided, refused to be silenced, refused to let their community's lifeblood be stolen. As the first light touched the mountains, Florence and Teddy found themselves on the porch, watching their neighbors drift home in groups, still talking, still planning, still united. We did it, Florence said, wonder in her voice. We really did it. You did it, Teddy corrected. That journal of yours, the way you turned their own words against them. We did it, Florence insisted. All of us. That's the only way it works. Inside, Sarah was already starting breakfast, humming as she worked. The ordinary sounds of a new day beginning filled the air, roosters crowing, doors opening, voices calling greetings. But underneath the familiar was something different, the sound of water flowing freely, the sound of justice served, the sound of a community that had faced down power and won. Florence leaned against Teddy's shoulder, feeling his solid warmth, the steady beat of his heart. They'd both come to Gila Crossing running from pain, seeking escape. Instead, they'd found something worth fighting for, worth building, worth staying for. No more running, she murmured. No more running, he agreed. The sun rose fully, painting the desert in shades of gold and promise. Somewhere, a meadowlark sang, not native to this place, but making a home anyway, its liquid notes spilling over the awakening town like a blessing. Florence smiled, remembering the silver buttons, remembering loss transformed to hope. Tomorrow she'd wear them on her wedding dress, carrying memory forward into joy. But today was for savoring victory, for planning futures, for the simple pleasure of sitting beside the man she loved in the town they'd helped to save. The trial was over. The real work of building a just community had just begun, and Florence Edison, soon to be Roosevelt, could hardly wait to start. Late summer painted the Arizona desert in shades of purple and gold. Wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the heat, their colors vivid against the red earth. Along the restored irrigation channels, young peach trees showed their first green fruit promises of sweetness to come. Florence stood on the porch of their newly completed home, watching Teddy repair a section of fence. The house wasn't large, 3 rooms built of adobe and timber, but it was theirs, raised by community hands and blessed with community hope. "Florence, Teddy," Sarah Turner's voice carried across the yard. "Town meeting in an hour. Something about the new railroad survey." They'd been married 3 months now, a ceremony simple and perfect as desert rain. Mary Sacagawea had played the organ while Reverend Booth spoke words about water in the wilderness and love that conquers fear. Florence wore her mother's dress, altered with silver bird buttons at the throat, while Teddy stood straight and proud in his one good suit. Now they worked side by side, Florence managing the expanded Edison and Roosevelt goods and repairs, while Teddy continued freight runs with better wages and safer routes. The sign she'd painted hung proudly, a business built on trust rather than exploitation. The town meeting buzzed with excitement and concern. Benjamin Curie had returned from Prescott with news that the Southern Pacific Railroad was considering a route through Gila Crossing. It could mean prosperity or another attempt at exploitation. "We need to be ready," Marcus Garvey said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Railroad brings opportunity, but also men who'd steal that opportunity for themselves. We have the water authority now." Jose Marti reminded them. "Legal structure to protect our resources." "And we have this," Florence added, holding up a bound volume. Over the months, she'd compiled their story, the struggle against Carnegie and Rockefeller, the trial, the community's victory, into a proper record. Our history, documented. Let anyone who comes here know what kind of town this is. The meeting stretched late as they planned safeguards, elected representatives to negotiate with the railroad, established rules for new businesses. Democracy was slow, sometimes frustrating, but infinitely preferable to the alternative they'd defeated. Walking home under stars, Teddy took Florence's hand. "You were brilliant in there, the way you think 3 steps ahead." "I learned from watching you," she said, "the way you read the desert, anticipate storms. I just apply it to people." They paused at the community, well rebuilt, deeper and stronger, with a new inscription: "Water is life. Life is shared." Gila Crossing, 1895. "Remember when we met?" Teddy asked softly. "At the ferry, you covered in mud, me babbling about never touching a lady." Florence laughed. "How could I forget you were so earnest, so careful? I thought you might faint when our hands touched." "I thought I might too," he admitted. "You were our everything I'd taught myself not to hope for. And you were exactly what I needed." Florence said, "Someone who understood loss but hadn't let it make him bitter. Someone who could be strong and gentle both." They continued home, but Teddy seemed restless. At their door, he stopped. "There's something I need to tell you. About that time in Texas, the fight that sent me running." Florence waited. They'd shared much, but some wounds took longer to heal. "The man I fought, he lived. I found out last month. Benjamin helped me send inquiries." Teddy's voice was thick with emotion. "He recovered. Has a family now. I wrote to him, apologized. He wrote back. What did he say? That young men do foolish things, that he'd done his share, that maybe it was time we both stopped carrying it. Teddy pulled out a worn letter. He said if I ever came back to Texas, we could share a drink and call it finished. Florence pulled him close, feeling the tension leave his body. You might take him up on that someday. Maybe, but not yet. Too much to build here. He gestured at their home, their town, their life. Besides, someone needs to keep you from taking on every railroad baron single-handed. She swatted him playfully, and they went inside to the simple comfort of their shared space. Florence lit the lamp while Teddy stoked the stove for evening tea. These quiet rituals had become precious proof that they'd moved beyond survival to truly living. Later, as they sat on the porch watching heat lightning dance across distant mountains, Florence felt a flutter in her belly. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't been certain until Victoria Woodhull confirmed it that morning. Teddy, she said carefully, how do you feel about adding a room to the house? Been thinking the same. Business is growing. Might need storage. Not for storage. She took his hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. For a cradle. The cup slipped from his other hand, shattering on the floor. He stared at her, then at his hand, then back at her face. You mean? Come spring, Victoria says everything looks perfect. What followed was a confused jumble of joy, terror, and approximately 15 questions asked simultaneously. When Teddy finally ran out of words, he knelt beside her chair, both hands now cradling her belly with infinite gentleness. A baby, he whispered. Our baby. Ours, Florence agreed, running her fingers through his hair. Born free in a free town, with clean water to drink and good people to guide them. Boy or girl, they'll know their history. Teddy said firmly, know what we fought for, what we built. They'll never have to wonder if they belong. The next morning brought the whole town to their door once Sarah spread the news. Gifts appeared, hand-carved toys, tiny clothes, promises of help. Esperanza Hidalgo brought traditional herbs for easy pregnancy. Li Ming's wife offered ancient wisdom about predicting the baby's gender. Mary Sacagawea promised to teach the child letters and numbers when the time came. This child belongs to all of us. Sarah declared, first baby born in free Gila Crossing. That makes them special. As autumn progressed, the railroad scouts arrived. Hard men with calculating eyes. They reminded Florence uncomfortably of Carnegie, but this time, the town was ready. The Water Authority presented unified terms, fair wages for local workers, respect for water rights, and community representation in station planning. You drive a hard bargain, the lead scout said after 3 days of negotiation. We drive a fair bargain, Marcus Garvey corrected. Take it or leave it. They took it. The railroad would come, but on Gila Crossing's terms. Winter came mild that year, with steady rains that filled the aquifers and set the desert blooming. Florence's belly grew round while Teddy fussed over her like a mother hen. She continued working sewing baby clothes between customer orders, documenting the town's growth, teaching young women to read and figure. You should rest, Teddy said for the 100th time, finding her at her desk. I'm resting, sitting down and everything. She showed him her latest project, a children's primer using local examples. A is for agua, precious as gold. B is for bravery, when neighbors are bold. He read over her shoulder, smiling. Our child's first book. Every child's first book. Mary wants to print copies for the school. Christmas brought unexpected visitors. Thomas Alva, now working for the territorial government, arrived with official documents. Water rights confirmed and registered, he announced proudly. Gila Crossing Community Water Authority is legally recognized. No one can take what you've built. The celebration lasted 3 days. In the midst of it, Florence felt the first quickening their child moving within her, dancing to fiddle music and laughter. She grabbed Teddy's hand, pressing it to the spot. His eyes widened with wonder. "Strong already," he said, "like their mother." "Gentle too," Florence added, "like their father." Spring came early, painting the desert in impossible colors. The peach trees bloomed pink and white, bees humming between blossoms. Florence grew large and content, watching their community flourish like the irrigated fields. The baby came with the first peach blossoms, after a long night where half the town waited anxiously outside. Victoria Woodhull's steady hands guided the delivery, while Teddy held Florence through each wave of pain. "A girl," Victoria announced at dawn, "perfect and loud as her mother." They named her Hope Margaret Roosevelt. Hope for the future. Margaret for the sister Teddy had lost. She had her mother's determined chin and her father's gray eyes. And from her first breath, she belonged to the desert and the community that had fought for her right to thrive. As Florence held her daughter for the first time, Teddy beside them both, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From mud-covered strangers at a ferry crossing to parents of a freeborn child. They'd traveled farther than miles could measure. "Look what we made," Teddy whispered, touching Hope's tiny fist. "All of us," Florence said, hearing the voices of neighbors still celebrating outside. "This whole beautiful, stubborn, impossible town. We all made this." Through the window, she could see the mountains turning gold with sunrise. Somewhere, a meadowlark sang the birds had found their way here after all, following the water, following the promise of home. The irrigation channels ran clear and strong, carrying life to fields and families alike. The new water tower bore fresh paint. Gila Crossing, where neighbors stand together. Below it, children of all colors played in the plaza while their parents planned and built and dreamed. The railroad would come soon, bringing change and challenge. But Florence had no fear. They'd proven what a united community could do. "She'll never doubt she's loved," Teddy said softly, watching Hope sleep. "Never wonder if she belongs." "None of our children will," Florence agreed, already imagining the town Hope would inherit just and green and free. As the sun climbed higher, bathing their small home in warmth, Florence closed her eyes and listened to her daughter's breathing, her husband's heartbeat, the distant sound of water flowing through channels carved by common purpose. They'd found their paradise after all, not in leaving but in staying, not in taking but in sharing. Not in touching a lady, but in joining hands with equals to build something lasting. The story of Gila Crossing would be told for generations, how greed was defeated by courage, how water meant for few became life for all, how two broken people found wholeness in each other and in the community they helped to save. But for now, in this perfect moment, Florence simply held her family close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for muddy ferries, careful men, and the unbreakable bonds that form when neighbors refuse to let each other fall. The desert bloomed around them, proof that with enough love and water and stubborn hope, even the driest ground could become a garden. And in that garden, a new generation would grow strong and free, inheriting not just land and water, but the knowledge that paradise isn't a place you find, it's a home you build, one act of courage at a time. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the Old West, where love bloomed as fierce as desert flowers and justice flowed like precious water. I hope Florence and Teddy's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Drop a comment below and let me know. I love connecting with fellow Western romance fans from around the world. If this tale of courage and community spoke to you, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 for more authentic frontier romances. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the story. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more listeners discover these tales of love and bravery in the American West. Until next time, partners, keep your hearts open and your courage strong.